What if I told you that the words Israel, Israelite, and Jew don't actually mean the same thing? And what if the story behind those names could change the way you see the entire Bible? We hear these words so often: Israel, Israelite, Jew. In the minds of many, they seem to blend into one. But if we look closer, we discover that each carries within a long, turbulent story, filled with covenants, promises, and trials that shaped history. So, were the Israelites always the same as the Jews? Are all Jews direct descendants of the 12 tribes? And what about the modern nation of Israel we know today? What does it mean in the grand story of the Bible? These are not just historical questions. They touch the very core of faith, the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a covenant that still echoes throughout time, even today. In this video, we will take a journey across thousands of years, from Abraham, the father of faith, to Jacob, the man who was called Israel, to the 12 tribes, the divided kingdoms, the pain of exile, and finally, the miraculous rebirth of modern Israel. And above all, we will see that every name, Israelite, Jew, Israeli, reflect a piece of God's great plan for humanity. Sparkles, so let us begin this journey, returning to the very beginning, where it all started, with one man called to leave his homeland and to walk by faith, Abraham. We stopped at Abraham, a man who was called to leave his homeland, to step into a future he did not yet know. And from Abraham, the story of Israel began. 1. Abraham, the beginning of a promise. The Bible records that God said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." This was not a short journey or a casual trip. It was a step of faith, a call to trust fully in the one who had promised. What God promised Abraham was astonishing. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. But there was something even more significant. Through his descendants, all nations on earth would be blessed. In other words, Israel was never meant to be just an ordinary people. They were chosen to be part of God's great plan of salvation for humanity. From Abraham, the promise passed to Isaac, then to Jacob, who later received a new name, Israel. And here lies the turning point, the moment when the term Israelite first came into being. To Jacob and the 12 tribes, the foundation of Israel. Jacob's story is one of the most dramatic in the Bible. He was not an ordinary man. He wrestled all night with an angel, and from that struggle, he received a new name, Israel, one who wrestles with God. That name was not only for Jacob, but also for his descendants. His 12 sons became the 12 tribes, laying the foundation for an entire nation. From that point on, when people spoke of Israelites, they referred to the descendants of Jacob, those who belonged to a special covenant with God. At this stage, all were called Israelites. There was no distinction among the tribes, whether Judah, Levi, or Benjamin. All shared one common identity, the people of Israel. But as you will soon see, their history was far from simple, and this complexity would eventually give rise to a new name, Jew. 3. The Golden Age and the division, when Israel was no longer one. Generations later, the Israelites entered the kingdom era, with notable kings such as Saul, David, and Solomon. Under Solomon, Israel reached its height of power and prosperity, and Jerusalem was chosen as the capital, home to the magnificent temple. Yet after Solomon's death, unity shattered. Around 930 BC, the kingdom split into two. The northern kingdom, Israel, made up of 10 tribes. The southern kingdom, Judah, made up of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, with Jerusalem as its capital. From Judah came a new term, Jew, initially used only for those from the tribe of Judah. Over time, however, Jew came to describe anyone connected to the temple in Jerusalem and faith in God. This marked a new chapter. Not all Israelites were Jews. Some were Israelites, but not of Judah. And this difference would grow sharper as history unfolded. For the fall of Israel and the lost 10 tribes, the northern kingdom of Israel drifted away from the covenant. Prophets warned them, but they worshipped other gods. Finally, in 722 BC, Assyria conquered Israel. The 10 tribes were taken away, scattered across the nations, and became known as the lost 10 tribes. The southern kingdom, Judah, endured for a time, holding on to Jerusalem and the temple. From this point onward, the name Jew became more prominent. People no longer simply said Israelite. They emphasized the people of Judah, those who kept the law and worshipped at Jerusalem. 5. The Babylonian exile, when Jew became an identity. But in 586 BC, Babylon invaded. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple burned, and the people of Judah were taken into exile. It was one of the most tragic moments in Jewish history. And yet, in exile, something remarkable happened. The Jews did not vanish. They clung to their faith, studied the law, and gathered in synagogues. They no longer had a temple or a land, but they still preserved their identity. From this moment, Jew was no longer just a tribal name. It became a spiritual, cultural, and religious identity. You didn't have to live in Jerusalem to be a Jew. If you held on to the faith, the law, and the tradition, you were a Jew. 6. Return and hope, the birth of a global Jewish community. When the Persian Empire defeated Babylon, King Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. Some returned, but many remained scattered, establishing Jewish communities across the ancient world. This created something unique. The Jews were not tied only to one land. They became a global community, carrying their faith and identity wherever they went. Ironically, exile and dispersion made them stronger, a people who could not easily be erased from history. 7. Modern Israel, when Jew and Israeli are not the same. After thousands of years in exile, in 1948, the state of Israel was reborn. A dream fulfilled, the Jewish people once again had a homeland. But this also introduced a new concept, Israeli, a citizen of the modern nation of Israel. Here's the interesting part. Not every Israeli is a Jew. Israel today is a diverse nation, home to Arabs, Christians, Druze, and Bedouins. Meanwhile, many Jews live across the globe, in the United States, Europe, Russia, without being citizens of Israel. Thus, we now have 3 overlapping identities. Israelite, the ancient descendants of Jacob and the 12 tribes. Jew, a religious and cultural community rooted in Judah and the Torah. Israeli, a modern citizen of the state of Israel. Each name carries its own story, yet all trace back to the covenant God made long ago. 8. Theological meaning. The covenant never lost. Looking across history, we see one constant. Israel is always at the heart of God's plan. From Abraham to the promise of the Messiah, to the prophet speaking of Israel's restoration, it all points to one truth. God is faithful to his promises. Even when the people were scattered, when the temple lay in ruins, when they lived in exile for centuries, the covenant still stood. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel declared that one day Israel will be restored, united, and live in peace under the reign of the Messiah. This is not just a story of the Jewish people. It is a story for all humanity. For through Israel, the blessing is given to all nations. 9. From then until now, a story still unfolding. When we look back, from Abraham to Jacob and the 12 tribes, to division, exile, return, dispersion, and rebirth, we see a single red thread, the faithfulness of God. Names may change. Circumstances may change. But God's promise never changes. And that is why, when we speak of Israel, Jews, or of Israelis, we are not only talking about history. We are talking about a story still unfolding, a story that each of us is a part in. And so, we have journeyed a long way, from Abraham, who left his homeland at the call of God, to Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and then to the 12 tribes, the painful split between Israel and Judah, the period of exile, the return, and the long, arduous centuries when this people had to live scattered all over the world. Finally, we witnessed the reestablishment of the nation of Israel in 1948, an event many believe was foretold in the Bible. But this story doesn't stop at history. What is more important is that each name, Israelite, Jew, Israeli, is a piece of the great picture that God is painting. It reminds us that names are not merely labels. They reflect identity. They reflect a covenant. And they reflect a part of his plan of salvation for all humanity. You might be asking yourself, why is this important to me, someone who lives thousands of miles and thousands of years away from these events? The answer lies in this. The story of Israel is also a mirror for the story of each of our faiths. Think about Abraham. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew that God had promised to bless him and his descendants, and he walked in faith. That is also the call for you and me today, to walk in faith, even when we don't see the whole picture clearly. Remember Jacob, who wrestled with God and was renamed Israel, meaning he who has struggled with God and won. The life of faith is like that. It's not always easy. We fall at times. We doubt at times. We have to wrestle in prayer. But it is in those struggles that God gives us a new name, a new identity. Look at the Jewish people, a small nation once exiled, once scattered, once facing annihilation, yet still existing to this day. That is no accident. It is proof that when God makes a covenant, he keeps his promises, regardless of time and circumstance. And look at modern Israel. Despite many controversies, conflicts, and even wars, the existence of Israel remains a living testimony that history is moving forward, exactly as the Bible foretold long ago. But above all, this story reminds us that God is not just writing history for a nation, but he is also writing the story of each individual. You and I are also invited to be a part of that story. You may not have the physical blood of Abraham, but in Christ, you are called a child of the promise. The Apostle Paul once wrote, "If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." This means that the covenant is not just for one people, but is extended to all who believe. So, when we look back at the names, Israelite, Jew, Israeli, don't just see them as historical terms. See them as reminders of a faithful God, a God who always keeps his promises, and a God who is still calling each of us to step into his story. You see, the Bible is not just old pages telling ancient stories. It is an invitation to walk in faith like Abraham, an invitation to persevere like Jacob, an invitation to trust that God is still sovereign over history, and he is also sovereign in your own life. Therefore, the next time you hear those names, Israel, Jew, Israeli, remember that behind them is a great story of covenant, of trials, of victory, and of God's unchanging love for humanity. And that story, it continues right in your life today.